pleased to have with me today Bill and Dee Gorden. Thanks for joining me on Legislative Report. We talked in the lobby a few minutes ago, and we've heard a lot about the greatest generation. When you hear that phrase, and I know my parents didn't think of themselves as being of the greatest generation, when you hear that phrase, what do you think?
Well, I think I agree with them, but I think it was the fact that our generation had opportunities that our previous generations and family did not have.
To meet challenges like the Depression, like the Second World War.
More people going to college, they made it possible. And a lot of people would never thought they'd go to college would wind up there. And it broadened everyone's life. And after the war, of course, people were used to traveling.
Seated next to you is this gentleman of how many years of marriage?
Coming up on 70 in another 2 or 3 months.
Well, we're going to have a big party there.
That would be wonderful.
I don't know if we can come up with 70 candles in the Heritage of Green Hills. But
no candles allowed.
We're going to try. A lot of folks, when they think of the greatest generation, they consider a call to duty. You sense that call in your own life during the Second World War?
Yeah. I was busy doing a lot of things back then. Even when I was 18, I started. But as time went on, I got to be more of an active person.
You enlisted when, and what caused you to enlist?
Well, they wanted someone to work in the Navy, and so when I was 18, I did.
Did you think at the beginning of that enlistment you would be a pilot? Was that a desire that you had?
No, not really then, because there was another war at that time, and so I was busy doing a lot of things. One of the things we used to have to do initially was to get a plane that didn't have any wings, and they had wings that we had guys who were hauling them away, and we did that for about 4 hours, and finally they came with a truck and picked them all up. But,
where was that at, Bill?
it was in Detroit, and so we took care of those things. And
you found yourself in the South Pacific as we advanced the story, and you were a Hellcat fighter pilot.
yes.
Tell us a little bit about that plane, and then we'll talk about the South Pacific, and then we're going to get back to another pilot in just a minute. You're in the South Pacific. You're on the USS Hancock.
Yes, and it was a good airplane. It was fairly new, and I was using it, and I went to the Hancock, and I was initially out in front of the Hancock. All the rest of them were in the back, and so I took off and was ready to start having some of the guys come play.
Can I have your wife amplify on a story that she told me recently? It was a catapult launch, correct, to get you airborne off the Hancock. And Dee mentioned that there was a time you almost ended up in the drink in the Pacific. Dee, why don't you pick that story up just for a minute as you related it to me?
Okay. It was the first time that he was going to be taking off catapult. And so someone had told him, or he'd asked questions the night before, to do certain things. Now, I never flew a plane like he flew, so I couldn't tell you what it was, but he may you remember. But if he did a certain thing with lever, I forget what it was.
I put on the Hancock, and I grabbed a hold of the material, and but when I took off, my hands came back, and so did the throttle.
Okay.
So
That was it.
So you went off the end of the aircraft carrier and you almost
Yes.
went into the
I'd
Pacific.
shoved the thing back up, but by that time I was at the front. I dove down to the water and leveled off, raised my wheels, and then I took off. And I didn't pull the throttle back till I got back to the rest of the airplanes.
Someone has described a carrier takeoff and landing as one of the most harrowing calls to duty in wartime. But when I had a discussion with you about this, you seem relatively relaxed about the whole process of taking off and landing. Is that just your temperament?
Well, I had to do a lot of things in order to be able to get off the bottom of the water.
Mm-hmm.
And I raised my wheels and took off and was all right. But
Well,
a lot of times when guys do that, they're stuck in the water. But
There's a lot of ways.
Oh,
Okay.
he
Good,
told
Dee.
me, yes, a little more detail on it. He said that the minute he started down, he heard the whistles go off and the ship. He saw the ship turning in the water. They didn't want to run over him. And so they made a sharp correction in their speed, and he heard all of this going on. But he didn't hit the water, fortunately.
yeah.
There's a lot of ways to get hurt and killed
Yes.
in aviation during the Second World War, and
Yeah.
probably none was quite as dangerous as carrier takeoffs and landing, not finding the ship, accidents, running
Yeah.
out of fuel. So there was a litany of ways that you ended up in the drink or not getting back.
Yeah.
And for you, I know the Grumman Avengers torpedo planes had several crew members, but on the Hellcat fighter, you're in that by yourself.
That's all we had was one plate, one seat.
And you've got a couple of 50 caliber machine guns, as I recall. The
We had
fight-
six of them,
All right.
and we had underneath we had about 6 bombs.
So we hear about multitasking kind of in the conventional language. You're flying the plane, you've got the machine guns, you're the bombardier, you're everything.
Yeah,
Little bit of pressure?
I don't remember.
That's good, that's good.
He's always handled pressure pretty
I
well.
don't
You,
remember.
okay, he's kind of a relaxed guy.
Yes,
All right.
yes.
So while we got machine guns, we got bombs, we have to
Yeah.
fly this off and on the carrier. But you did engage the enemy, and you did engage enemy targets. That
Oh yeah,
you remember.
yeah.
What's it like the first time, or maybe every time, you're firing on the enemy, whether it's air or sea or land-based or releasing bombs?
Yeah. Oh, we sometimes are able to drop some bombs on them too,
Right.
and
I can remember a discussion relative to what is it like when you're engaging in combat, and I can remember one World War II veteran saying, "I sure hope I didn't kill anybody." What's going through your mind when you're releasing bombs and munition? You can't necessarily see the enemy as easily when you're airborne, but that has to be a powerful emotional experience, realizing you are in combat. It's unlike anything you face domestically or in your life.
yeah.
Is that a distillable moment? You can reflect on that, you think, what was going through your heart and your mind as you're in combat?
Well, we sometimes we're just fighting a single plane in the air, and we sometimes do shoot them. But once we do that, we forget them because they may just go down into the water and drop off that way. But
Kind of time to move on.
Yeah.
Dee, you flew, and so it's very unusual for me to have a conversation with a World War II aviator, and he's married someone who's also involved in aviation domestically. I've not asked you this before in our own private conversations, but what's it like in a marriage of aviators? Early on, did you talk about aviation and flying?
Yeah, we did, but that was pretty much the end of my flying once we were married. I kept it up for a year or two, but it's something I grew up wanting to do. I was fascinated with airplanes, like I said.
Still are.
And yes, still are, but it's not like it used to be.
Yeah. Well, it's 1945. Bill's flying
Yeah.
in the South Pacific. You're flying domestically. Probably weren't a whole lot of men flying domestically at the time. You were in a Piper Cub. And
Yeah, I just trained in the single engine. And what happened was that my life, I had no idea I would go to college, but I met someone working, and she was the oldest of 4 girls. Her mother had passed away 3 or 4 years prior to meeting her, and her father was legally blind, and she was supporting the family and going to college at night. And I woke up and I thought, hey, I don't have any of those problems. And I guess if she can do it, I can do it. So I made up my mind that I was going to put every dime. I walked 3 miles to church and back and saved 20 cents so that I could, that was part of my college money. And when I had enough to get me through the first couple years of college, I went to college. And I also worked when I got there. So I was older than most of the freshmen. And in fact, when I first got there, I found out that Eva Marie Saint was also at that college,
okay.
Bowling Green State University. And that wasn't far from my home, about a couple-hour drive at the most.
while we're talking domestically, maybe you can open up a little window for us. The mood of the country, rationing, working together. This is total war and the whole country is involved.
Yes.
Patriotism. What did that feel like growing up during the World War II
Well, I was
era?
a teenager, and
Well, that's old enough.
Yeah. My dad was one of the neighborhood wardens.
Okay.
At every night at a certain time, he took a flashlight with him, and that's all, and walked out after dark and had his own little section.
Detroit.
Yes. And he had his own streets that he had to patrol, make sure that all the curtains were closed, no lights showing out through the curtains. And then when everything was tied down for the night, he'd come home and go to bed.
And people accepted there's a
Absolutely.
new set of rules. We have to
Absolutely.
comport with them. The country's at war.
Yes. And I remember the rationing, and you had certain rations for slips for meat and certain for the other groceries, and everyone lived with it. And there was no problem. You just accepted it because America was at war.
But we were attacked.
Yes,
clearly.
we were.
December 7th, 1941, Pearl Harbor is attacked. Where were you? What were you thinking? How is this going to change your life? Could you contemplate that? I'll start with Dee.
Okay, that was a Sunday. And by that time, I had met Bill the year before and joined that church because there were 30 or 40 teenagers. And my parents had chosen a church with older people. And I don't think there were more than 4 teenagers in the whole congregation. So I asked my parents, that's fine with them. And so I changed, didn't have to change faith, but changed just churches. And had a ball because we were so busy. Thursday night was choir, and Friday night was bowling, church bowling league, and then sometimes on Saturdays they had something planned, and always on Sunday, church in the morning, go home for dinner and come back and spend the rest of the day and evening at church with all these teenagers. So we had a wonderful time. And wasn't necessary to have private dates in those days. We were always together in a group.
It's a group.
Yes, so we went on weekend trips to church camp and so on, always with chaperones. But
And that's where you heard that Pearl Harbor
oh no,
was
Pearl
attacked.
Harbor, I was shopping it was my turn and my friend's turn to bring the food for the evening, well, just a quick snack for everybody.
Right.
And we were in a delicatessen. In those days, these stores weren't open, most of them on Sundays.
Sunday.
So we were in the delicatessen, and all of a sudden they had the radio on, and it came on. So that's where I was when President Roosevelt made his statement, and that we were at war. So,
Bill, do you recall where you were at? Pearl Harbor's attacked, what it meant to you?
Well, it's a long time ago.
Probably at church.
Well, you better have been in church.
Yeah.
I wasn't in church,
Well, it was in the afternoon.
yeah.
Yeah.
But I went back into the Navy, and then I wanted to fly. So I spent many months flying, and I flew this airplane that was pretty good, and I did that pretty well, and then I went back on a carrier, and so that was I was usually up in the front of it because I was all by myself.
It was a call to action for you. Second World War starts as far as the United States
Yeah.
involvement. When you were done a flight, you went out, you engaged the enemy if you could locate them, and I think as I looked through flight logs of World War II, it wasn't always we flew off, we attacked the enemy. Sometimes you couldn't find the enemy. Sometimes pilots got lost, confused, weather or whatever, and you end up returning back. But you went into the flight room, and you were debriefed there after a flight. You were questioned as to what happened, what did you see, what was going on.
Yeah. Yeah, we got briefed, but it didn't take long to tell everybody what we were doing.
You're back in the, yeah, I'm sure. You're back in your flight room, and you realize some seats are empty. There were some of your shipmates who didn't come back.
Yeah.
What's that moment like when you realize there's an empty seat in the room and it's long past the time they should be back and they're probably not coming back? Is it tough?
Well, that was always pretty tough, and they talked over that for just a few minutes, and that was it, and then we began to talk about a lot of other things, and so it was tough when you lost one of your guys, and you know, it was fine.
Well, I know this is deeply personal, the question I'm going to ask, because I've talked to others of the World War II era, and they may have been bitter toward the Japanese. They may have been upset with them. Did that ever rise up in you, a little bit of anger? They attacked us at Pearl Harbor. Now there's an empty seat in this flight room. I've lost a friend, and they're responsible.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, you know, later in the war, we were starting to hit a lot of the islands there where there were other, like Japanese there. And then we finally ended up at Japan, and we were fighting, or sending a lot of aircraft into Japan.
The bombers,
Bombers,
General Curtis
yeah.
LeMay.
Yeah,
Sure.
Yeah.
The aerial bombardment was very intense, and
yeah,
certainly the attacks on Japanese bases by virtue of the Hancock being engaged meant there was a lot of anti-aircraft fire coming up at your planes at that time.
well, we were flying more out of the ship towards Japan. So we didn't have the ship close to Japan, but we were flying into Japan and flying a lot of the different air places that we needed to hit. And
It's September the 2nd, 1945. The Hancock is in Tokyo Bay.
yeah,
Later you would berth at Yokohama.
yeah,
You're overflying the USS Missouri on
Yeah.
September 2nd, 1945.
yeah.
A show of force over the USS Missouri. What did it feel like knowing the war is over and the unconditional surrender is being signed below where you're flying?
Well, shortly after that, after the war was over, we went back to Pearl Harbor.
Mm-hmm.
And most of the people on Pearl Harbor took the ship again, and they went out to get a lot of the other people who were in different places.
Operation Magic Carpet, if I recall, they went up and they actually used the Hancock to ferry the troops back home.
Right, right.
I had read somewhere there were actually bunk beds on the flight deck. I don't know if you'd heard
Yeah,
that
yeah,
as well.
yeah. But when we went back to Pearl Harbor, they allowed me to get off because I wanted to go back to school and get going again.
Right.
So
When you were at Pearl Harbor, and the Hancock was in and out of Pearl Harbor and Ulithi on several different occasions as a consequence of being hit, and it was back for repairs,
yeah,
were you able to look out on the scene of Pearl Harbor and the Arizona still sitting out there?
oh yeah, yeah. It was. It was a little different. Once we got on the ship, we took off and you couldn't see the rest of but when we were just flying there before we ever started, we flew over that area and we could see a lot of the area and what it looked like and so forth.
I can just imagine if someone's at Pearl Harbor, which is where the war began, there was probably a lot of gazing out there
Yeah.
on some of the destruction that still existed, though I know they lifted many of the ships. Bill's off at war. You have a casual relationship, and it buds after the war. From your perspective, how did that all begin?
Well, I was already had been to college for a couple of years, and I went out on my interview I saw an ad in the Detroit paper that Capital Airlines was interviewing for their stewardesses, or as we were called, hostess in those days. And I knew that I wasn't ready for it. You had to be 21 to work for the airlines in those days, and I wasn't quite 21. But I had my license, flying license at that time. So anyway, I made an appointment and went for an interview just to see if I was on the right track. And we came home and I thought, I'm definitely on the right track. But I was packing to go back to school for another year at Bowling Green, and I got a telegram, report on Tuesday, the day after Labor Day, report for training. And we're waiting there are two requirements. You had to be 21 and you had to have a bachelor's degree. But I'd had enough experience in the work world, and I was 21. In fact, I was 21 the day I took my first flight out as a hostess. So my training was over with by the time I became 21. But everything was gelling very rapidly. then. So.
And was anything gelling here with Bill?
No, not at that point, because the war was just over. He wasn't home yet. And I, being the new girl on the, the totem pole, I usually got the weekend flights and the long flights, which I loved. I loved the long ones anyway. And because it was 1 day on and 3 days off. But I had to get up at 4 in the morning and didn't get back home till close to 4 the next morning sometimes.
Talk about
Yes,
a long day.
Yeah. And I always bid for the flights that had 7 or 8 stops. I loved the takeoffs and landings and all the people. I loved all the people. So I was very, very busy in those days. But
It sounds like you got married, what?
7 years after we met.
7 years after. Well, what took so long? 7 years?
Well, the war.
Yeah, that's
You
right.
had a war. You had a war to fight.
That's right.
And of course, working on weekends, I seldom got to church. But I did have a weekend off. And when I went to church there, he came in the choir. I didn't know he was back from the service. And so I was very much surprised that he came home unattached.
Just between us, okay? You see him up in the choir there. Do you have your eye on this guy back from World War II?
I really liked it. And there were a lot of choices in that group of young men. In fact, there were 8 of us that went to church that Christmas morning, and 3 of us married the boys from that church.
I see.
Yeah, so we had a lot of options.
Who noticed who first, okay? Bill comes back. There weren't too many girls on Navy ships in those days, okay?
Wasn't any.
Yeah, exactly. You
Yeah.
come back, and let's, be honest here. You're thinking logically about relationships and marriage, right?
Yeah.
Okay? Who makes the opening move here? Says hi,
Oh,
expresses.
that's another whole story. You don't have time
Well,
to
you
hear
have.
that.
Can you give me the 30-second version?
Well, it also happened that an announcement was in that Sunday paper that I finally went to church and saw him in the choir. And I went home and I looked at the paper, and it was there announcing my engagement to a Canadian Royal Air Force
Your
pilot.
engagement.
My engagement. Because I hadn't heard from him in all those years, and all those boys that I did know, they were all coming back with wives or they're getting married right away. And so I never dreamed that he'd come back unattached. And when I saw him in the choir that morning, I went home and told my parents that I'm going to cut that engagement off right now. But my picture was in the paper with that.
Did you see that picture, Bill?
Oh, did he ever?
No, what did you think? Come on now. Just between you and I at this point, what are you thinking when you see that picture in the paper?
Well, I thought it was good.
You're way too easy. You folks are wonderful. Bill, thanks so much for taking a few minutes with me.
Okay.
I appreciate it.
Well,
Dee.
thank you, Mike.
You folks are wonderful. Well, that's all the time that we have for Legislative Report. If we can help you on any state-related issue out of our office, please feel free to call us, and that contact information will be on the screen to follow.